to the 14th Living God's Future Now conversation, hosted by Heart Edge. Heart Edge is an ecumenical movement for church renewal arising out of St Martin the Fields in London, now on 4 continents globally, that believes renewal of the heart comes from the edge and seeks to catalyse kingdom communities through the 4 C's of commerce, culture, compassion and congregational life. Since May 2020, we've been running a continuous festival of theology and practice, of which this monthly second Thursday conversation is the flagship event. Check notices in the chat or on our website for how to get more involved. Today, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Anthony Reddie. Dr. Anthony Reddie is director of the Oxford Centre for Religion and Culture, researching the intersection of Black liberation theology and practical theology. He's a widely respected observer and scholar in the fields of conscientization and empowerment. And he was the recipient of the Archbishop of Canterbury's 2020 Lanfranc Award for exceptional and sustained contribution to Black theology in Britain and beyond. Well, Anthony, thanks so much for joining us. I wonder if we could start with the question: what does the word post-colonial mean to you, and how does it most significantly impact society and theology in Britain today?
Actually, that's a great question to start with, and I suppose there's a long way of answering it, and there's a relatively shorter way of answering it. I'll go for the shorter way, because obviously people do PhDs on this stuff and write reams and reams of paper. That's essentially really what a post-colonial approach to theology is, or the relationship between theology and post-colonialism, is really the recognition that empire, in all its various manifestations, has been a feature of human life, certainly for well over a millennia. And theology and the place of the church has been, I think, right at the epicenter of that. Sometimes resisting and critiquing empire and imperialism, sometimes colluding with it and going alongside with it and benefiting from that. The most, I guess, sort of recent iteration that shapes my life would be the British Empire. So at its peak, like 24% of the world, all those bits in pink on globes and maps of a certain generation were all the bits that were controlled by or run directly by Britain. And my own parents, my own antecedents, really, in terms of come from the Caribbean island of Jamaica, shapes that. So there's a relationship between those various parts of the world and Britain. And part of the, I guess, the interesting sort of dialectic or the intellectual struggle around understanding the term is a relationship that, even though empires for the last part have come to an end, so various parts of the British Empire were either voluntarily given up or through a kind of political and military struggle, the Brits that were encouraged to kind of walk away from them in the second half of the 20th century. That a lot of the ideas and the tropes that kind of help to sort of determine empire are still with us. And they've kind of embedded themselves into theology, into the way in which we see the world, into what we perceive as being normal and what we see as problematic or transgressive. And therefore, that sense of how do those ideas, how do those perspectives shape how we see the world? So, for example, just a very, very quick example, that there was a meme sort of going around Twitter and on social media, actually around the current England football team. And what it and this particular meme has a image of all the teams standing up, and it simply says, so the England football team without immigration, and then points out to about like the 3 or 4 pure, and use it in inverted commas because actually none of us are pure, you know, I mean, all of us are mongrels anyway. But like the idea of the only pure white players, about 3 or 4 of them in the team. So this is a team that is very much in many respects reflective of modern Britain. But the truth is, it's a modern Britain that is contested because there are some who see our present incarnation as being problematic, and what they would love is to go back to the good old days. Not sure when those good old days were, but like that, in some respects, they would like to go back maybe pre World War II, when we were still a big, great imperial power. And then there are others who will say, well, actually, those days were not so great, and maybe actually where we are now is better because we're more plural, we're more diverse. That sense of contestation around that is central to how we think about notions of post-colonial. Is to say that the past has gone, but the ideas and the influences of it are still embedded within our world, within British society, and actually within theology and within the church. I could say more, but I'll stop there for now.
Well, I'd like you to say more. I mean, I wonder if you could. It could start with society, I guess, and I guess there's also the issue is what you're saying is post-colonial is still colonial.
Yeah.
Could you say more about that?
Yeah. So one of the misnomers sometimes when we use the term is that like we think post means kind of beyond or kind of after. And in some respects it does mean that, but what it also means, it's also the way in which what's the relationship between that past and the present. So in what ways have we gone beyond the era of colonialism? But in what ways is there this slippage, this seepage from a kind of historical past into kind of the present? And in what ways then does that shape our consciousness? In what ways does that shape our awareness? Fundamental for me is what does it mean then to be British? And who gets to be British? And what are the markers of that? What are the indices that make for kind of authentic belonging, really? And central to that also, I think, is what then is the role of faith and identity, because these things are very much contested. Just to give a very quick example from my own experience. A lot of my work is very much sort of narrative driven. So a lot of it is about stories and identities and the way in which we think of ourselves as kind of human subjects. So I'm born and brought up in Bradford, West Yorkshire, still a Yorkshire accent, even though I've lived for 38 years in Birmingham. And it's often said that you can take the man out of Yorkshire, but you can't take Yorkshire out of the man. So in some regards, I'm very Yorkshire because I don't live there. You know, like there's something about Yorkshire folk who are so proud of the county. We love it so much, that's why we don't live there. You know, so the likes of Michael Parkinson and Jeff Boycott and various other people who wear their Yorkshire stuff on their sleeve, but they don't live there and haven't lived there for years. Well, I'm as guilty as they are, you know. I love it so much, that's why I live in Birmingham. So at one level, I think of myself as Bradfordian, but in a very historical sense, because I haven't lived there for a long time. And to be honest with you, I spent most of my life outside of the place than inside it. And so parts of this thing talk about post-colonials, this notion of a play on words of root, R-O-O-T, and root, R-O-U-T-E. And the sense in which all of us are in the process of that negotiation between the places where we come from and the places that have formed and shaped us. And our journeys, both physical, literal journeys, as well as mental, intellectual, and cultural journeys. And that sense of fluidity and continuity and change, and those things have always been played out within us as individuals. But also, I think they then get played out at a macro level within the context of what it means to be a nation. So, for example, that when we celebrate particular events, a number of things are always going on at the same time. At one level, there's a kind of historical kind of antecedent. So when we kind of celebrate St. George's Day, or whether we mark Queen's birthday or other historic moments in the life of the country, it's both it is both a contemporary event at that moment, but it's also something that's drawing upon kind of historical roots and memory. And those things, as I said, are always contested. So nostalgia has a huge impact in how those things get played out. So I will romanticize Bradford and growing up and how wonderful it was. But if you came to me and said, Anthony, I've got a time machine and I'll take you back, and you can go back to East Bowling circa 1980, the truth is I don't want to go back. The truth is I live a nice, comfortable middle-class life now in Birmingham, in Moseley, in ways that is a huge amplification, much better than anything in terms of where I came from. And yet, if you ask me where I belong, and if you ask me for my identity, I'm going to go back to a historic rooted moment that is both me and not me. I'm that and that, and yet I'm beyond it. And so within that also is this power of myth. And myths are very powerful. As we know, they're powerful in terms of Christian story, in terms of not necessarily about whether something's literally true or not, but more importantly, what does it tell us about ourselves? So how do myths generate meaning? And we wrestle a lot with myths, both within the corporate sense of identity of being British. So in some regards, we still think backwards to kind of World War II and so that plucky sense of being British, fighting against like the whole of Europe and resisting Nazi tyranny. And for me, it's not uncommon, and I think we still hear it sometimes, or perhaps amongst the older generation who will tell you that was a simpler and a happier time when you could leave your door open and community was better and people were friendlier and we were more connected to each other. And I suspect there's a lot of truth in that. But again, if you ask people if they would literally want to go back to that period, most of us would not. So post-colonial, I think, tries to wrestle with all of those dynamics, both within an individual sense of what it is to be a human subject, how we think about our identities, plural, and the fact that they're not fixed, the fact that cultures are not fixed, the fact that we live in space and time in a particular context, and the past is a foreign country that we have no passport, so we can't go back to. But it doesn't mean that that past does not constantly live with us and shape us in ways that are both powerful and sometimes deeply unhelpful.
And I wonder if you could talk about how that works in the church.
Yeah, well, I mean, that is very, very powerful in the church because I think it's Soren Kierkegaard who says that life is lived forward but understood backwards. And so much of how we create identity is usually by looking backwards, looking at the direction from which we have come. So one of the things I remember being taught by one of my first lecturers in history at Birmingham University when I was an undergraduate in the 80s. And he said that when we often think about what it is to be human, like we talk about walking into the future, and he says that's not true. As human beings, like we don't, in figurative metaphorical terms, we don't walk into the future. What we're actually doing is that we are standing with our face to the past. And we're looking at the past and we're walking slowly into the future, but with our back facing the future and our face facing backwards in terms of where we come from. All that to say, if you think of our Christian faith, we are shaped by tradition and scripture, both of which are not in the future, they're behind us. And we're shaped by a story that we retell and we rehearse in terms of what has gone on, that we believe will shape us into the future. But obviously, we're drawing on resources of the past in terms of where we've come from. And part of the way in which I think the church struggles with kind of modernity and even now post-modernity is, of course, what we have is a history that is replete of stories when the church was bigger, more confident, more significant, more important, perhaps had a much more defining role within the body politic of the world and certainly of nations, certainly of Britain, for example. So I grew up in a city centre mission. A city centre Methodist mission was built in 1872. So it was built at the time, at the back end of the Victorian era, when Methodism was growing exponentially. And certainly if you read the records at that point, there was a kind of a real sort of sense of Methodist hubris, you know. So essentially, we come out of the Church of England, we're kind of Anglican wannabes and Free Church refusing it, so we can't quite make up our mind which of the two we are, and those things are still there with us. And the 6th mission seated 1,500 people. And actually, if you look at the records, even when it was built, it was already redundant. So already when they were building it, they knew as they were building this 1,500 chapels, a cathedral to nonconformism, and not accidentally was built almost opposite Bradford Cathedral on purpose to say, well, of course, okay, it's like you may be the state church, but like we're the real church of the people. So let's build our version of our cathedral. So even when it was built, it was already obsolete. So I grew up in the 1970s and 80s in that church. And all you could hear was, which again was pure mythology, was, well, actually, in the 1920s when there was revival, the church was full. The church was never full. It was never full. But yet the story we told ourselves was, well, of course, in those days, if you didn't turn up half an hour before the service, you could not get a seat. And you had to, and they were swinging from the chandeliers and the balconies, and it was full, and there was revival and pure mythology. So when I grew up with this sense in which our present is unsure, the future scares us, but what a fantastic past we have. Let's tell the stories of the past. And there's a sense in which I think that's not just for Methodism or for this particular church I grew up in, Eastbrook Hall, that is now long closed. I think there's something of a larger corporate spirit that Christianity and the church struggles with in Britain because of that history. That glorious history, I put glorious in inverted commas because actually it wasn't quite so glorious if you really look at it. And so oftentimes when we have a struggle with sort of contemporary life, the temptation then to go into the past and to think that by retreating into the past or even sort of trying to reinvoke it or to reimagine it, that somehow will give us resources to take us in the future. And maybe sometimes it will, because, you know, I mean, we know that within history, there invariably are things that we can recover. There are things that we can try and learn from. But I think one of the issues I often find a lot with, particularly with historic churches, because I guess with newer Pentecostal churches, that's a different narrative, and I think they have a different arc that they themselves are working with. And I suspect that they will run into their own, I guess, sort of socio-cultural, political and demographic challenges in maybe 20, 30 years' time, but certainly within the historic traditions in the early part of the 21st century, that what we're struggling with is a kind of redefinition. So like we know that God is still with us, we believe in death and resurrection, although of course as human beings, actually no one actually ever really wants to die, you know, so actually what we really want is a kind of resuscitation, you know. I mean, if God could come and just sort of pump a bit of life into the existing body rather than a real sense that maybe we may have to die in our present incarnation in order for a new body to come. But I'm not soothsayer any more than you are, so therefore none of us actually know what that looks like, which is another reason why we end up then clinging to the past, because that's the thing we know. So how often have you heard those fateful words, well, we could change, but that's how we do it around here. And it's like, well, okay, so yeah, we have done it around here, but like you notice that what we've been doing has not been working for a long time, but let's still do it anyway, because obviously that's where our security lies and that's where we feel an element of comfort. So how we understand that zeitgeist, how we understand what are the particular cultural, political, social challenges, and how does the church speak to that? With that tension of being confident, without being triumphalistic. Because I think that's the thing that I don't miss about the past. That as someone whose first degree was in church history at Birmingham University, that what struck me actually was that when you delved into Christendom, what you often saw was a church that was not particularly good at being humble, was not particularly servant-like, so even though like we use a language of servanthood, and it's within our liturgies. Every priest or minister gets ordained on the basis that they're going to exercise servant leadership. It's central to our discipleship. We don't practice it, if we're honest. And certainly when you're powerful and you're self-important, you have no great reason to do so. And we didn't really do it that well. I think we're better at doing it now, but I think that's because it's almost a necessity on us now, because actually no one looks to the church in the first order for meaning. They try to find it in other places, and then we often step into the breach.
So if we could make the next move, we've talked about society, we've talked about the church, and in a sense, the last in that chain is God, is theology. You've talked about how you grew up in Bradford. My guess is you saw a white Jesus on a cross. You saw a white bearded old man looking down from a high heaven. You might call that a colonial theology, perhaps, quite possibly, quite reasonably. I wonder if you could talk about two things then. First of all, how you made a journey to decolonize, or how the Holy Spirit decolonized your faith, and you started to see different images for God, and then to what extent you've wrestled. Well, you obviously have, but the way you've wrestled with whether Christianity is inherently is locked into a kind of colonizing mentality.
Yeah. Well, okay. Let's answer the first question first. For me, it was quite a huge seismic shift in terms of making that development. So when I grew up in that same church I mentioned, that we were one of only two black families. So there's a congregation of, I mean, by modern standards, it was a big congregation. So somewhere in the region of 300 odd people, 300 plus people would turn up on a Sunday, both morning and evening. And of that 300 odd membership, of which maybe about 250 would turn up on a regular basis and worship, we were one of only, so 6 in my family, 3 in the Dunkley, 9 black people. And the real existential moment came for me, and apologies for those who have read some of my books and have heard this story before, was when I was about 11. So I was in Sunday school, and we used to meet as the seniors in what was then called a parlour. So it was a large drafty building right at the back of the church. So you put all the young people far away from all the important consenting adults, so that in our youthful exuberance, like we will not upset their stage worship. So we meet in this large room, and on the far wall was a picture of Jesus who looked more like Bjorn Borg than Bjorn Borg looks like Bjorn Borg. And what I remember about the picture of Jesus was he had the pierces blue size, long, obviously very, very stylized. It's long hair, but certainly very stylized, with a beard. Clearly there was a Remington beard trimmer in first century Judea, because obviously this is a very well-crafted beard, and he was a handsome-looking, blonde-haired man. And also, it was one of those pictures whereby that actually, so wherever you walk, like if you looked at a picture, the eyes of Jesus always followed you. One of those things. And I used to find this picture fascinating. And eventually I summed up the courage to ask my Sunday school teacher. And I said, but miss, if that's Jesus who's the Son of God, so if I understand it, is that he represents what God is. And she said, yes. And obviously at that point, she was probably pleased, thinking, okay, so all this Sunday school stuff seems to have stuck, because obviously that's a good answer. And I said, okay. And I said, and if we're all created in the image and likeness of God, She says, yeah. So then who am I? And there was this long silence. And she said, it doesn't matter, Anthony. And as an answer, it helped and didn't help in equal measure. At one level, it helped because she said it didn't matter. And I was born into a family that said that God had no colour and God loved everyone. And in fairness, I never had any sense that I was not loved by God. And I never had any sense that I was not a member of the body of Christ. This was as Bart says, fantastic. It was a fantastic church. It was racist. The people were racist. But they were racist because that was the culture of the time, not because that they were terrible people. But, however, it was a church that was run by white people, for white people, and we were the odd anomaly in terms of only being one of only 2 black families in that church. So essentially, I imbibed this evangelical, nonconformist, pro-empire, internalized forms of colonization into my faith. So I go to University of Birmingham, and I'm doing a degree in church history. And I get involved in the student Christian movement, and I get involved in the chaplaincy work. That begins to politicize me a bit more, but my faith is still, it's probably not as evangelical now. It's become much more radical, but it's still very white. The real transformation from that early iteration to something much more, I guess, contextual for myself was when I began to work as a church youth worker in Handsworth, in North South Birmingham. So these are Handsworth and Lascelles are 2 of the oldest black communities in Birmingham in terms of people coming from the Windrush and settling into these areas, first in bedsits and then buying their own houses. Still very, very, now they're still both very, very poor. They're still very diverse. They're still very, very multicultural. And I was working for 2 churches, 2 black majority churches, Methodist churches, where most of the membership were people who come from the Windrush generation, both from Jamaica and then from the South Caribbean islands, mainly of St. Kitts and Nevis and Montserrat. And my job was to work with the children and grandchildren who were connected to the church and to the wider community. And the thing I began to wrestle with in those contexts was, so where is God in this? And what is God doing in the midst of this poverty, in the midst of this major social alienation of the people who are living there? In the midst of, certainly in terms of the schools, that most of the young people I worked with did not attain anything in the way of qualifications at schools. The most interesting dynamic I found, certainly being in Handsworth, was that there were two grammar schools right in the centre of this conurbation. Both are King Edward's schools, King Edward's boys' school, King Edward's girls' schools. Virtually all the pupils there were white who were bussed in from other parts of the city. Most of the locals would never set foot in those schools. There was big walls surrounding the schools, and basically they were almost like foreign territory in the middle of these 2 areas. And as I began to think about, so what is the good news of Jesus Christ for this context? Well, the churches were doing good work in terms of keeping people going, giving them a sense of not giving up against all the prevailing social forces that were faced against them, but actually wasn't saying anything prophetic around the nature of the context in which this was in. So why is it that it was easier for children in Sutton Coldfield and in nice, white, leafy, wealthy suburbs had to be bussed into a school in this particular area, but virtually no one in the area would ever set foot in that school because there was 11 plus that was almost impossible to pass if you were black and working class going to these local schools. And why was that never seen as a problem? Why was that never seen as problematic? Why did no one even talk about it? So about that time, I then had a very fateful moment. I remember it very clearly. It's the 19th of August, 1992. And I was talking to my supervisor, who was like the superintendent minister, and he said, "Oh, Anthony, so we've got some money in our budget, and we feel that you probably should do some type of training, sort of vocational training. There are courses going at the local Queen's Foundation where several years later I actually ended up working for a number of years. And there's a new guy who's just started a man called Robert Beckford, and he's just started a course in Black theology. And here's a flyer that's been sent out from Queen's. Have a look at it. It might be something that you'd be interested in." And so I remember going on a taster, must have been the second week in September, that Robert taught this class in Black Christian Studies. And it was like a light bulb going off in my head. Just all of a sudden, it's like, bing! And suddenly, things I'd never seen before became very clear. And I remember the first handout he gave us in this introductory class was an extract from the first Black theology anthology that was published in 1980, that was edited by James Cone and Gaylord Wilmore. And in the introduction, there was a long introduction of which Robert photocopied about the first 15, 20 pages as an introduction to Black liberation theology. And I literally fell in love with Black theology at that moment. And I remember going home to my bedsit and thinking to myself, I don't think I can believe what I was told in my Sunday school and what I learned at university. There's something happening to me that I know I need to attend to. And within that next year, I must have bought as many Black theology books as I could. This was the day before Amazon and before ways of getting hold of texts from all over the world. There was one Black bookshop in Handsworth. I have to run by a very, very crusty, not a very, very customer-friendly guy called Marcel. You know, I mean, the dictum that the customer is always right was not a concept that Marcel had ever heard of. So, you know, it's like you came to a shop and he would verbally abuse you, right, and then wonder why people actually did not want to come in and browse and buy anything. Anyway, so I would take his abuse anyway, and I would bring in these orders and say, okay, I want to order these books from America. At that point, there were no Black theology books in Britain. And so I bought about half a dozen of James Cone's books, various other books by Gaylord Wilmore, books by South African Black theologians. And then the question then became, well, this is fine, but this is not Britain. I'm Caribbean, not African American. What then does Black theology look like if we began to do that in Britain? And that then got me onto a process of eventually becoming a student at the University of Birmingham, doing my own doctoral studies. And as I said, the rest is history, and many books later. So therefore, on to the second question. I think there's always been a contested relationship about Black bodies and Black liberation theology with this broader project called Christianity. And it's a troubled, contested relationship because on the one level, colonialism is built into it. Not just in terms of the British, the experience of British, but of course, any student of church history knows that there is a point at which Christianity goes from being this dissident movement that's underground in catacombs and is an enemy of Rome, to suddenly it becomes part of Rome, it becomes part of the empire. That Constantine converts and Christianity happily then becomes part of empire. So we've been, as a movement, part of empire for a long time. Actually, the truth is that we've spent more time being a part of empire than we have actually been a dissident movement that was anti-imperial. So long before the Brits turned up, long before European powers turned up, we were already a faith that had been implicated with imperialism. So part of what I guess post-colonial scholars like myself have often wrestled with is it possible to decontext? Is it possible to deconstruct the faith to the point whereby we can extricate ourselves from empire? Because I'm not entirely sure we are. And the best analogy I often use when I teach the students this is that, so let's say like you pick up a piece of fruit and it's bruised. And you say, okay, well, I don't need the bruised bits, so I'll cut it away. Well, here's the thing. After a while, if you're not careful, like you've cut away so much that you haven't got actually anything of the fruit left. And therefore, at one level, I think a part of me says, I'm not sure that we can actually ever deconstruct Christianity to the point whereby we can extricate ourselves from empire, because it's been such a part of us that if the faith is mostly 2,000 years old, then basically, let's face it, 1,500 years of it, 1,600 years of it, maybe give or take a century or so, has been imbued with empire, has been imbued with sitting at the top table with power and being a client of that, having a symbiotic relationship. And when we think about things like the sort of divine right of kings, for example, that's a classic conflation of empire on the one hand and Christian faith on the other. And yet for all that critique, at the heart of it is this dissonant rabbi, a Palestinian Jew, who, however we look at the New Testament witness, is not empire. He is against empire. He is fighting a revolution of love, a revolution that understands that authentic revolutionary change starts with the heart and moves outwards. Rather than what tends to happen when we think of it in humanistic terms, is that like we think of overthrow of the overall structure and then hope that we can bring people along with us. And there's no evidence that that ever actually brings about authentic change. That what tends to happen is that violence begets violence. So one group overthrows the other group, and the group who overthrows them ends up then being as almost as barbaric as the one they overthrew before, and you end up with this unhelpful cycle. So Jesus' revolution of love is one that is trying to create a systemic, big posh word, epistemological change, a change in how we understand knowledge and truth and self, that creates a break that says, actually, there's a new way of being human. There's a new way of being human that is not tied to aggrandizement, that is not tied to privilege and power, but is about servanthood and loving one another. It's that bit that I think that keeps Black and liberation and post-colonial scholars like myself within this broad tent of Christianity. Because I think for all its messiness and for all the ways in which it has disappointed me continually in terms of the institution, I remain faithful to it because within it I see the creative sparks of renewal that come from a God that is always improvising, that is always challenging us to change, and is figured in a radical Jesus who speaks against empire. So one of the things I often do sometimes with students is that I get them to read the passage in the Gospels where Jesus is with Pilate. And they're kind of sussing each other out, and Pilate's asking questions of Jesus, and Jesus knows that they're trying to trap him, but he's giving very, very elusive answers. And then Pilate says, well, so what is truth? And I guess one of the biggest challenges that we often have when we read that in terms of the history of Christendom is that every time we read it as the church, we read that and we identify with Jesus and we say, well, of course, we know which side we're on. But the truth is, most times actually, we're Pilate, not Jesus. That actually, when we think of the impact of empire, the impact of having power over others, we certainly, as a British church and someone who has his British accent, well, Yorkshire accent, who is implicated within empire. So as much as I'm critiquing it, my schooling, my education, my pension, all the things that I take for granted are tied up with the very system that I'm critiquing at the same time. Therefore, when I present this passage and I said to the students, so look at this and tell me what's going on in the dynamics. And tell me who you identified with. Well, of course, not unreasonably, all the students say, well, of course, all of us identify with Jesus. You know, we're here to do a course in Christian theology. That's a bit of a dumb question, Dr. Reddie. You know, I mean, why are you asking us? You know, I mean, obviously, no one's going to say, well, actually, now you mention it, I think Pilate's quite a cool guy. No one ever says that. Of course they don't. But here's the thing. Part of the critique of this whole framework of talk about post-colonial theology and post-colonial identities is to recognize the fact that for the bulk of its history in terms of British churches, we have been more representative of Pilate than we have been of Jesus. So part of the issue is firstly to recognize that, is to recognize the embedded way in which we have been part of the problem, not necessarily part of the solution, but then at the same time to say that, of course, what gives us hope is God. That what gives us hope is that this Jesus that we read about is, of course, not just a dead historical figure. He's actually someone who is alive where two or three are gathered and is constantly nudging us, challenging us, sometimes shouting at us, but like we're not listening, to say, actually, you can be different. Here are ways of being different. And every time we meet as church, and for example, every time we celebrate the Eucharist, that what we say in the liturgy is that we believe that at that moment that Christ is with us. And the power of that radicalism is made manifest within us as a means of going out and being different and critiquing Pilate and asking Pilate to repent and say that to speak truth to power is not to be arrogant in terms of what we have to say, but to say it with humility and gentleness, but to say it with conviction nonetheless, to say that what we perceive now as being normal is not the kingdom. That I think part of the challenge we have is that for a long time during the context of Christendom, there was a temptation almost to think that empire was providential, and somehow this was almost coterminous with the kingdom. So actually saw political kingdoms and a spiritual theological kingdom are kind of synonymous, you know. So basically, so democracy and the British way of life is kind of just really what God wants anyway. Now, to be clear, that's not to say that everything about that is terrible, of course not. And the truth is, I'm a creature of that. So the education I have, the reason that I'm sitting here talking to you is because the truth is that, like, you perceive me as being someone who has something worth to say because of the work I have done that's come within a system, as I said, that I will critique, but yet I've also benefited from. So, you know, I mean, so I've always sort of tried to work on the dictum of taking the work I do seriously, but not take myself too seriously, because being a sconce in Oxford University hardly is a seat of revolutionary change. Let's be perfectly frank about that. You know, I mean, so both of us, I think both of us have had our relationships with Oxford in the past. So, you know, I mean, so the fact is I have to sit lightly with my sort of revolutionary credentials because I'm still a creature of empire. But, however, I still want to believe that at the heart of this contested, problematic institution called church and this problematic phenomena called Christianity is still a prophetic God that calls us to hold on to the notions of the first being last and the last being first, and the body of Christ where all of us are important and where even the bits that are seen to be insignificant have a special place in God's economy. And we're asked to be alongside those who are on the margins. I'm not the best advert for Methodism, but I still love the way in which I think one of the things that John Wesley said to his early followers was, well, not followers, sorry, Freudian slip. Although like we do sort of tend to elevate Wesley almost to a point of kind of, you know, God the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, and just a little bit below is John Wesley. however, one of the things that Wesley said to the early Methodists was don't just go to those who need you, but go to those who need you the most. By no means was he a liberation theologian by any means, but certainly someone who was a Black liberation theologian. I do believe passionately in God's preferential option for those who are on the margins and those who are oppressed.
Now, I wonder if you could talk us through one subtlety of this field. When Kelly Brown Douglas joined me in conversation in this forum a few months ago, she set out her vision, which was very much about a struggle against white supremacy. And she described in some detail about how many aspects of culture and faith were raced, to use her verb. And I know both you and she have both been profoundly influenced by James Cone. And yet there's a different tone of voice about Black theology in this country. And it's always in danger. The Black theology in this country is always in danger, this is my perception, correct me if I'm wrong, of being overshadowed by Black theology in the States. Yeah. That must be a thing you live with almost daily, I would imagine.
Indeed, yes. Yes.
So I wonder if you could talk us through some of the subtleties of that, because that's a subtlety that could easily be missed, I think, by people who might think Black theology is all the same.
Yeah.
Where would you locate yourself in relation to some of those Cone and someone like Kelly Brown?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that I have a huge amount in common with them. That I think that their theological agenda is one that has very much informed my own, and I very much see myself as being within the Cone tradition, because obviously there are different traditions within Black theology, and I would see myself as being within the Cone tradition. The fundamental difference between us are not necessarily in terms of theological ideas, where I think, well, certainly for myself, I would see myself as being very much influenced by them, and we have a huge amount in common. It's, as you say, it's partly about tone, and part of that is to do with the demographics of how Black theology developed in America and how it developed in Britain. So in America, it comes out of an African-American experience of people who were slaves on the continent of America, in terms of being brought in chains from Africa. So when Cone talks about his experience of lynching, or when he talks about his experience of being on the end of visceral white supremacy, so one bit in some of his early work, and certainly in his last book that came out posthumously, he talks about the fear of growing up with a father who was a very radical Garveyite in the American South, in a place called Baden, Arkansas, where the Ku Klux Klan were in evidence all throughout that town, and even the mayor and the police were members of the Ku Klux Klan, and the fear that one day their father would not come back. That clearly informs a way in which Black theology then talks about race within the American context in terms of the body politic of a place that has segregation, that has had the Ku Klux Klan, that has had lynching. That informs how they create that language. In the British context, it's different because, so for the most part, most of Black and Asian people come from migrant families. So the fact is, although there's a connection between the Africa and the Caribbean and Britain, technically my family did not have any physical space in Britain before my mum came on the 22nd of January 1957. So part of that point, our story is in the Caribbean. It's still influenced by Britain because of empire. So Jamaica was a crown colony from 1694 right through to independence on the 6th of August in 1962. So obviously there was still a strong relationship with Britain, but it's a relationship in another place. Therefore, when it comes to being in a British context, although there have been Black people in Britain since the Roman times, they were a relatively small community. In terms of our mass numbers, it's really post-Windrush, 22nd of June 1948. So a little over 70 years. Therefore, I think what shapes conversations or shapes the discourse is the difference between coming from a migrant family, where I think certainly if I think my parents' generation, they always thought of themselves as being transitory. And by that I mean is that nearly everyone came with the view that they were going to go back. So therefore, what they didn't do was try to make provision for a long-term stake, and that was never in their consciousness. And so when I was growing up, I would still talk about back home because that's what my parents would talk about back home. So I would talk about back home, even though back home was this mythical place of Jamaica that I did not visit till I was 17 years old. And when I didn't particularly enjoy it at the time because at that point I realized actually just how English I was. And therefore I was like this odd, awkward English boy, born and brought up in inner city Bradford, that's so a million miles away from rural Jamaica, where my parents were from, in just one generation. That, I think, therefore changes the conversation. Also, I think what impacts upon the way in which theology gets done is that, of course, what's been one of the curious things about Britain is that whereas I think America always understood itself as being racist, that one of Cohn's great essays that I remember editing in the Black Theology Journal, which was really weird to having to edit the work of your hero, was its title is Theology's Great Sin. Theology's Great Sin, Silence in the Face of White Supremacy. But in talking about that, Cohn is talking about America. He's not talking about Britain, he's talking about America. He's saying America's original sin is a country that's based on genocide and of indigenous native peoples on the one hand, and the importation of millions of slaves in order to create in order to create an agrarian economy within the Americas, and the church says nothing, and white theologians say nothing. So that's its great sin. In the British context, here's the oddity. If you look at the demographics of Black and Asian marginalization, they're almost synonymous with America. And yet there's been no segregation. There have been no laws that say that Black people cannot buy a house in this area. There have just been economics and forms of racism that are built into our forms of custom, of how we speak and how we engage with each other, that are much more subtle than anything America does. So one of the reasons why I think Black theology has flourished in America initially is partly out of numbers, So like you've got 50 million African Americans, maybe 60 million African Americans, and you've got just under 1 million Black people in Britain. Those differences are huge. So in America, also, like you've had 400, essentially, as long as the country has been a country, there have been enslaved people in it who have developed their own institutions that have then helped to give rise to Black theology. Black theology in Britain only really begins to get going in like the 1990s. So at one level, I'm still part of very much a first generation. Whereas in America, even Cohn would say that even before him, there were already African-American leaders, people like, I guess supremely Martin Luther King, for example, Benjamin E. Mays, and
Howard Thurman, people like that.
Howard Thurman, that's the word I was looking for, Howard Thurman, yeah. And various other people who had already been around, may not call themselves Black theologians, but they were already asking critical questions about this corporate America and this notion of America being a Christian country that has this notion of invoking God to bless it, for example. But what is God being asked to bless is I guess the question that Cohn and various other people have asked that question. Well, obviously, in Britain, like, we've never had that infrastructure. We still don't. Also, as well, I think because what we've also had is a much stronger sense of coalition. So when I write about Black theology, I'm using that in two senses. Partly I'm writing out of an African perspective, in my case, African Caribbean perspective, but I'm also in terms of coalition politics, that's certainly very important when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, I'm also including Asian people. In America, black theology exclusively means people of African descent. And if you've been really, really clear, it really means African Americans. In the British context, when I talk about black theology, I'm still often including Asian brothers and sisters. Because actually what we all have in common as immigrants or migrants is that all of us actually have actually come from the empire. So we've come from India and Pakistan and Bangladesh and various contexts in Africa and then various contexts in the Caribbean. And although the British relationship with all those places was subtle and different, they were overall that the dynamics were very similar. So therefore, black theology in Britain tends to be, in terms of tone, it tends to be not as caustic. And some of that, I suspect, is also a measure of being socialized within a particular context. So as I said, actually one of the things that always strikes me when I go abroad, particularly to the Caribbean, particularly to Jamaica, is how English I am. So again, actually, so for my critiques, there's a story I tell. It's a trivial story, but it's quite suggestive. I remember being with my dad in Jamaica about 10 years ago, and we went to the bank. I'm going to change up some money, and we were queuing for ages. And we sat in the queue in the sun, waiting to get into his bank in Jamaica. And as is the Jamaican custom, people would walk by, and if they saw someone they knew at the head of the queue, they would just walk in and just kind of go in there and say, "Oh, yeah, come in the back." Now, I'm sitting there now with my unexamined, undeconstructed, internalized notions of fair play being English. And I'm just my dad saying, "But Dad, he just pushed in." And I said, "Yeah, but let it go. It's Jamaica." "But Dad, it's not fair." "Yeah, I know, but let it go." "Okay, that's it. Someone else comes and pushes. I think, "But Dad, this, I'm getting upset." My dad says, "Anthony, it's not England, okay? Now, I know in England, you would queue and we'd all know our place, and heaven forbid anyone would push in because that's such a faux pas. That, of course, often been very English. We wouldn't tell them off. We give them this look of sheer disgust and frowning at them. That, of course, with utter shame, they would retreat and go back into their rightful place because that's how the world operates. Now, I say that's a trivial story, but I say that to say that obviously when I write my version of black theology, I'm not James Cone. I have not seen people lynched. I have not been on the receiving end of a legislative process that says that I cannot do this. That doesn't mean that those things don't exist. It just means that they are very much encoded within within issues of class. So class and race, I think, are issues in Britain that don't have similar dynamics in America. So I think all that to say that I think part of the contextualization of black theology in Britain has been about, so what does it mean to be a migrant? Or in my case, more accurately, to come from a migrant family, to come from a place where your roots here are significant, but they don't go back centuries. They are, in my case, just over 50 odd years. You're still kind of negotiating your identity in a way that Kelly Brown Douglas would not, because obviously her family go back as old as the country is. And therefore there's a sense in which that she's not expecting to negotiate anything, because her view would be, I'm American, and therefore my rights are these things. Now, that doesn't mean that black people don't think like that, but it just means that we are still working those things out, because actually with the grand sweep of history, 50, 60, 70 years is still relatively nothing, really. And therefore, I think to talk about black theology in Britain with a British accent, which is, I think, another way of talking about what that looks like, is very different. So, for example, I think of some of my friends who are Anglicans, for example. So to be an Anglican within an established church is an interesting way of doing black theology. I mean, it's certainly possible, and I've got several friends who do it, but of course, especially as priests, are doing that in a context that has no equivalent at all in America. So, so yes, So someone like Caliban Douglas is an Episcopalian, but but even the other day, quite recently, I was told. I mean, I can't say who told me this, but a friend of mine was having a conversation with her, and she did not know that there are two archbishops in Britain. She was not saying, "Oh, but two." Well, yeah, because there are two provinces. Really, she says. Well, yeah. So her thing is, well, so who knew that? Well, obviously, if you're over here,
I'm really sorry, Anthony. It's 7 o'clock. I feels like we've just started. That was really a fascinating exploration. I guess that the point that we never quite finalized, and maybe I'm going to say now, is that what Christians are in society is represented by what you're recovering. And I mean, I guess you've said this, but we've almost had 1700 years of forgetting the things that you're teaching us again. So, and that's partly about social location, but it's also partly about the insights that you've drawn in from people like James Cone, Robert Beckford in this country, and from other groups, the generosity that you've shown to other groups in terms of not making it all about your own identity, but bringing in so many others, which of course is what the church is. So thank you for your honesty, your wonderful stories about. I will remember that story about Jamaica for a long time. I'm sure many of us identify with that on many levels. And your insight and your wisdom and just your kindness of spirit that you've shown us because we're all at different places on this discovery, but it clearly is such a significant political, social, theological moment that we're in right now. And you've articulated that so acutely. We're very, very grateful to you. There's more to come from Anthony, everybody, quite soon, and you've seen in the chat some details about that. So please look out for that and for the next conversation that I'll be having with Ben Quash in September. So please join us for that. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you for the questions and the thoughts you put in the chat. There have been some very appreciative notes, Anthony, which I'm sure you haven't seen because you've been focused on our conversation. Thank you to everybody. Thank you especially to Anthony for your generosity and your wisdom, which we've all benefited from hugely. And every blessing on your future researches, particularly in this area of empire. Thank you so much, everybody, and thank you to Anthony.